This is Comic Shenanigans, episode 1076, a conversation with Glenn Greenberg.
Ain't no stopping them shenanigans. Love getting into shenanigans. All up in them shenanigans. 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 Shenanigans.
Welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. I'm your host, Adam Chapman. This is episode 1076. It's a conversation with Glenn Greenberg. Glenn was an editor at Marvel Comics in the mid to late 90s. He was also a writer, and he worked on some of my favorite Spider-Man stories. He was the editor of, or I guess technically the assistant editor, but really I think he was taking a lot of the lead here on the Spider-Man Hobgoblin Lives miniseries, which has always been a personal favorite of mine. He also worked on the short storyline, three-part storyline in Spectacular Spider-Man called Goblins at the Gate that he did with Roger Stern, with artwork by Luke Ross. That's actually most of what we talk about in this episode. I try to get the focus on Goblins at the Gate and asking other various questions about goblins, etc. I do recommend that you search out Glenn's blog, as he did do a blog post in the early, I think it was around 2011 or so, talking about Hobgoblin Lives and Goblins at the Gate, because that was the time when they were finally being collected together as part of a new trade paperback collection, which is hard to believe it's that old a collection now. It's definitely been a prized possession of mine. It was always great to have those stories finally in a softcover collected format. It's always a real pleasure to talk with Glenn. He's been on the show numerous times in the past, so you can definitely, if you're interested, check out the back catalog to see the last times that Glenn was on the show. That would include episodes 1028 to 1007, 940, and 912. So if you want to check out some more Glenn Greenberg, you can check it out there. He's also doing a bit of the podcast circuit right now, so he's showing up here and there. Tremendous stories. It's always nice talking with Glenn, and I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. You can email me at comicshenanigans@gmail.com. You can rate the show on Apple Podcasts, listen to us on Apple Podcasts, and also listen to us on Spotify. Thanks again for listening, and let's get right into the conversation with Glenn Greenberg. Enjoy. Glenn, welcome back to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing fine. Thank you once again for having me back. I'm catching up on the number of Ron Friends appearances on this show.
I mean, he's definitely a good friend of the show.
Yeah.
And actually, I'm going to be interviewing him again shortly about Spider-Man: Revenge of the Green Goblin.
I enjoyed that series. Just strictly as a reader, I really enjoyed it.
I haven't read it in a long time. I'm about to read it this week to kind of refresh myself. But I remember really enjoying it, really liking the art, and I was sad that a lot of the threads never really got picked up on, unfortunately. And I think Ron's a little sad about that too. But I'm very excited to go back over that with him in the coming week. I don't know if you had a chance to listen to my conversation with him about his Hercules miniseries with Tom DeFalco in the 90s, but that was a really interesting delving into his work, because I didn't realize that he had changed his style because he's basically told by Tom Brevoort that the editor-in-chief didn't want him to do the book because he thought he knew what that looked like and didn't want that. So he had to change up his artistic style for that reason. And he took it as a challenge, and he did a really good job.
Well, I was the assistant editor on that series, right?
Oh, that's right. I didn't realize. I knew Tom obviously Tom Brevoort was the editor.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't realized. Of course, you were the assistant editor. So, do you have anything you can tell me about working on that project with them?
Just it was a pleasure. It was always a pleasure to work with Tom and Ron. I didn't have a lot of creative input on that. Actually, I don't think Brevoort did either. I think it was basically we were scrambling for projects, because I think this was during that time when Heroes Reborn was going on. And so Liefeld and Lee had, the Avengers characters and the Fantastic Four characters. So we had to, beef up the characters we were left with. And one of those characters obviously was Hercules. So I think it was just a matter of, we're going to do this project with DeFalco and Friends. And with DeFalco and Friends, it's basically you hire them and you get out of their way. You let them do it. You let them do what they're going to do. There's nothing. There's it's unless Tom DeFalco forgets a little bit of arcane paraphernalia, trivial continuity stuff, and you call him up and say, oh, but Tom, you can't do this because it was established in this issue that he did this. That's it. I mean, and of all the times that I worked with Tom, I think that only happened once. And he took it in stride. He was like, yeah, you're right. I've got the old issues up in my attic, and I completely forgot about that. I should have just looked at the Masterworks or whatever. So that was it. You don't have to really edit Tom and Ron. Okay. So it made our job, Brevoort and it made our jobs just very easy. I was aware of the editor-in-chief's opinion of Ron. He wasn't as flashy or as current or as hot as some of the other artists that were at Marvel at the time. And this particular editor-in-chief was always chasing after the hot thing. What's the next hot thing? What's the next hot thing? I'll never forget. At this point, I don't care about whether I should talk about it or not. I'm just going to talk about it. Okay. I was hanging out in somebody's office after hours, and the editor-in-chief came by and said that he was really getting hammered by the executives upstairs that the books are very hard to read. Because this was still in the Image era, where it was all about flash and no substance, and storytelling had pretty much gone out the window. And so the editor-in-chief was saying, yeah, I'm getting hammered by the people upstairs. They said they're looking at the books. They can't tell what's going on from panel to panel, from page to page. It's, the storytelling is, we've got to focus on better storytelling now. We've got to focus on storytelling. And I said to him, well, if that's the case, then Ron Frenz should be one of our greatest assets because he's one of the best storytellers around. And I just looked at him completely straight-faced, right into his eyes. And he couldn't argue with me because he knew I was right, that Ron Frenz was one of the best storytellers, but Ron didn't fit his mold of, who we should be using. So he literally went yeah, but I gotta go. And he flew out of the office. So that was my, that was my big Ron Frenz story when it came to the editor-in-chief. Of course, I didn't agree with him on that particular point, and I would have used Ron as much as Ron could handle the work. So
it is interesting looking at that book now and knowing what I know, as Ron told me about. Why he felt that he was going to have to do something a little bit different, and I can see the changes that he made in his style. It's really interesting because it's still Ron, but you can tell that Ron is channeling something different and trying to do something different. So it's a fascinating experience knowing that now as a reader to go back and read that with that lens.
Well, honestly, I don't remember Brevoort saying that to Ron. I don't doubt that he did. It's just not something that I distinctly remember. But I actually, when the pages were coming in, I didn't notice that Ron was really demonstrably changing his style. For me, as long as it looked like Ron, I was happy. And I probably didn't look at it any deeper than that. It was oh, the new Ron Friends pages are in. I looked at them. They look great. They look like Ron. Moving along, move it along the process. So that was probably as far as I in terms of consideration that I gave it. But it's very interesting that you say that because I honestly I don't remember Ron even trying to change his style. But there you go.
It's very interesting. So I have
who was his inker? Who was Ron's inker on that? Was that Pat Olive?
Oh, shoot. I don't have that in front of me.
I think it was Pat Olive inked him. Maybe that – that certainly added – that would have certainly added a new dimension to Ron's stuff the same way when George Perez inked him on the first issue of Hobgoblin Lives. It brought a new dimension to Ron's stuff, but it was still clearly Ron.
True. Oh, yeah. There's no mistaking. It's still him. Just some of the – I think – the thing that stuck out to me, some of the angles, some of the choices felt a little different, but like not in a bad way. I don't want in any way to say that it was negative. It was just interesting because I've read, as you can imagine, like I've seen a lot of his pencils over the years. It was just interesting to see something a little bit different. You are right. It is Pat Olive who did the finished art.
Okay, see, my memory isn't completely gone. But yeah, I mean, I don't recall before. They may have, but I don't recall before that Pat ever inking Ron. And so that combination certainly did give Ron's work a different sort of look to it. Because Pat's primarily a penciler himself. So, him inking Ron, I haven't looked at the book in however many years, but I'm sure it had a different look than the usual Ron Friend stuff. Even on like when he went over to DC to do Superman, he was being inked by the same guys who were inking him at Marvel. Brett Breeding and I think Joe Rubinstein. So there was certainly a consistency to that. Having Pat ink him, yeah, absolutely, it would have looked a little different.
So before we jump into our main subject today, I'm going to do something a little bit different. So in a recent episode, I had Dan Gaboston of the Amazing Spider Attack podcast on, and we were talking about 3 issues of Amazing Spider-Man from, I believe, 97. And I just happened to be flipping through the issue, and because I had my actual physical issue out, and it came across the bullpen bulletins, and who got the editorial profile but Glenn Greenberg himself. Yeah. So I have one question for you. I want to see if your answer's changed. The best movie you've ever seen?
It would be either it's a tie, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan or The Empire Strikes Back.
Okay, so you said Empire Strikes Back at the time.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And let's see if this may have changed, but the worst movie you've ever seen?
Oh boy, probably Highlander 2: The Quickening.
That's you gave it a 3-way tie, and Highlander 2 was one of your answers.
Oh, what were the other? What were the other 2?
You're consistent. You said Crash and Halloween 6.
Well, yeah, those still that still applies. But yeah, Highlander 2 is probably the obviously it's the one that first came to mind because I just loved the first one so much, and to just see it degenerate into that after only one movie, I mean, at least with Halloween 6, there were 5 movies in between before it got that bad.
That's right.
Halloween 5 was no bargain either, but Halloween 6 was just the nadir. But yeah, I think Highlander 2 hurt more.
I appreciate that after 28 years, you're still consistent.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
One thing I also brought to mind, I thought I would at least ask. When I was looking at this bullpen bulletins, at the very bottom, Marvel Online at the time would have been a relatively new thing, and I know you worked on the Cyber comic, which I have questions about. But also, which I thought was interesting because I would not have thought of this early. This is September '97, and it had Marvel Online chat schedule for the week, and you were on there July 15th, 1997. Assistant editor and writer Glenn Greenberg, and you did an online chat. So what was that like at the time? Because I can't even imagine what that looked like at the time, because I was barely on the internet at all. I think I had very limited access, if any. So I'm curious what the Marvel Online chat would have even been like at that time. Was it a lot of people there, or what was it like? There were people. You'd show up, and a lot of times, the fans, you'd show up and the fans were having a conversation, and then you'd show up and you say, "Hi, I'm here," and they would just keep having their conversation. Like, it was very much like high school. Hopefully somebody would take notice that you were there and bring you in, or you would, you would say, "Hey, anybody have any questions about the stuff I'm working on?" And, you would generate the conversation. And hopefully it would take. I did it, each session that I was there for was either like, I don't remember if it was a half hour or an hour. I'm sure it wasn't more than an hour. But yeah, I was a regular. I was part of that schedule, as you pointed out. I do remember being charmed sometimes by some of the people. I remember there was one
I don't know how old he was, but I'm going to assume he was a boy, where he started a conversation with me, and I started asking him some questions, and he happened to mention that he wasn't at home. He was on his grandpa's computer, and he just referred to him as his grandpa, not grandfather. I don't know. It just touched my heart. You know, I'm on my grandpa's computer right now, so I don't. And I was like, oh. And I remember if that would have been 97, I wouldn't have been married yet. So I turned to my girlfriend, later my wife, and I just said, "Oh, this kid is like not breaking my heart, but like he's like melting my heart." It's like, you know, he's on his grandpa's computer, and you know, what's he doing with his time? He's, you know, on the Marvel AOL account, you know, with a chat with me. So, you know, I just was, you know, it was stuff like that. Just, you know, is the stuff that I remember.
Now, I guess I should ask, because we're in this kind of milieu. I never saw it, and I don't even know how anyone would ever see it or how it would exist now. But what was it like working on the cyber comic?
It was very similar to writing a regular comic book, other than the fact that you have to factor in like animation kind of stuff. It's like, you know, if an action scene, you can suggest, you know, have Spider-Man do a flip in midair, you know, and then the artist would draw, you know, I don't know, not panels, but like overlays, you know, to have that, to capture that motion of Spider-Man doing a somersault in midair and stuff like that. So I had to keep that kind of stuff in mind. Obviously, you're writing for a different format, so you don't have as many panels. You know, you're not writing on a page. I think it was like 3 panels per page. I really don't remember. It was so long ago, but it was the same approach. Plot, art, script kind of thing, Marvel method, but you're working in a different format, and so you're not plotting it per page. You're really thinking about, you know, the pacing. You're pacing it as if, you know, somebody's reading it and clicking through from panel to panel or page to page, however it was. But like, you know, in comic books, you can have up to 9 panels on a page, and that was not the case here. I think it was like, you know, maybe 1 or 2. It's almost like reading like a comic strip, I think, if I remember correctly. But again, you have to factor in that the things are moving, the characters are in motion, and you know, you have to figure out, you know, what's the you know, the best way to sort of choreograph that kind of stuff. In terms of the writing, though, I just you know, I consulted with my editor. Like, you know, sometimes she had specific things that she wanted me to touch upon to reflect what was going on in the comic book. So, like, let's say if the X-Men were doing a storyline at the time about the Friends of Humanity, which was that organization, like a paramilitary kind of organization that hated mutants, she said, "Why don't you do something with that?" So it's like thematically tied into what's going on with the regular books. And I was like, okay. And then I had to find out who the Friends of Humanity were, because I wasn't reading the X-Men books. Even when I was at Marvel. And then I remember there was one story. I actually pitched it to Steve Gerber as a comic book story. Because you may remember there was this whole big flap between Steve Gerber and Marvel over Howard the Duck. And so he did a crossover story for Eric Larson, Destroyer Duck and Savage Dragon. Do you know about this?
I do.
Yeah, and then the whole thing, the way Gerber wrote it was at the end of the Savage Dragon Howard Destroyer Duck story. Steve heavily implied that he captured Howard the Duck back from the Marvel Universe, and we got some heat for that from the execs upstairs, but I was still on good terms with Gerber after that. So I said, "Hey, why don't you do a one-shot called Spider-Man Maximum Plumage, where you do a whole thing with Spider-Man and Howard the Duck." And he was like, "Glenn, I appreciate your what did he call it? I appreciate your rebelliousness." That wasn't the word, but it was along those lines. He said, "But no, I really don't want to write for Marvel right now." I said, "All right." So I took the idea and I did it for the cyber comic.
Okay.
Where Spider-Man gets involved with Howard the Duck, and it's all about Dr. Bong is cloning Howard the Duck and all this kind of stuff. And it would have been much better if Steve Gerber had written it, but I was like, yeah, we need content, so I'll just do the story myself.
So let's get into, we're going to get into Goblins at the Gate, which has always been a personal favorite of mine. It's
Mine
very
too.
funny to me, actually, looking back, how many times things that I loved as a kid had your fingerprints on them, because we've already talked before about how Osborne Journal was a huge thing for me, and that was something that obviously you put together. Hobgoblin Lives was also like right in the sweet spot when I started buying Spider-Man regularly, and you were obviously heavily involved in putting that together. And then a year or two later, then you do Goblins at the Gate, and I, having loved Hobgoblin Lives, was like, oh my god, we're bringing the Hobgoblin back. So it's just funny to me that of that trifecta, like I was there experiencing it in real time and loving it, and not even realizing that you were the connective tissue between those three things. You and
Well, I'm flattered and very happy to hear all that. I mean, I know how big a fan you are of Osborne Journal. It's just one of those things. It's serendipitous. And I'm just glad that you took to it so enthusiastically.
I guess so. I'll close the loop for one more time on the Osborne Journal. But how have people asked you about it over the years? I know I asked you a lot about it. We did a whole episode dedicated to it because it's always been such a favorite of mine. Does it ever come up often, or do people ask you about it?
I mean, these days, not often so much anymore, because there's so much that's come since then. And the Clone Journal is really old news at this point. I mean, my understanding is at least some of what I did in the Osborne Journal was debunked since it came out. I mean, for the longest time, they stuck to it. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, certain things have. Well, actually, the minute we brought back Aunt May, the cracks started to show, because in the Osborne Journal, I definitively stated that Aunt May's death Norman had nothing to do with, and then not only did she not die, but Norman was behind her supposed death. So you really have to sort of bend over backwards and twist yourself in a pretzel to say, well, he wasn't responsible for her death because she wasn't really dead. And it's like, well, why would he do those twists and turns and twisting himself into a pretzel in his own journal, and then the whole thing about Harry. Well, actually, you know what? I'm a few years behind on current Spider-Man continuity. I know a little bit about what's happened since then. So, I mean, you're not spoiling it for me if you're keeping up with this stuff. Harry was never really back from the dead, was he? Or was he?
Okay. So when they first kind of brought him back, they explained that he wasn't really dead to begin with. And then eventually it got so much more convoluted that I don't know the answer after that.
Oh, okay. Because this is during the Nick Spencer run, which
Nick Spencer run is where it got really complicated.
Yeah, I've only read the first quarter of it, I know bits and pieces about what's coming up, but I heard something along the lines of, oh no, Harry was never back. So if that's the case, if Harry was never back to begin with, then actually some of the Osborne Journal comes back into play. But anyway, to answer your question, I every now and then somebody will bring it up. I didn't sell when I sold a bunch of copies over the summer when I was at a convention in Springfield, Massachusetts, and then another convention in Connecticut. Those went pretty well. Those sold pretty well. So yeah, I mean, it's not as much as I think you're hoping. in terms of people coming up to me, I think I get much more praise for my Star Trek stuff. I hear much more about. And lately, believe it or not, the one thing I don't want to hear about is the Rampaging Hulk. Over the last few months, I've gotten some very positive comments about the Rampaging Hulk, and I just kind of roll my eyes. But that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, I won't get into that one. So I will tell people to check out your former blog, your old blog post from 2011 about Hobgoblin Lives and Goblins at the Gate, because it was a good primer for me to reread. in advance of our conversation, just to get some of the kind of the context. Questions I had. One of the first ones that came up to me when I thought about it was when you found out that, first of all, the Goblins at the Gate was going to be recollected at all and repackaged with Hobgoblin Lives. Like, did that take you by surprise? Because at the time, I would say, like, nowadays it feels like eventually everything will get reprinted in some way. It just may take a while. But I don't think it felt that way 13, 14 years ago. So were you surprised when you found out that it was going to be repackaged?
I wouldn't say surprised. I was just more like, excited when I first heard. I didn't have time to be surprised. I got an email from Roger Stern giving me a heads up about it. And I was like, oh, wow. Well, that makes perfect sense to put those two stories together. So I was like, oh, good. I mean, I wouldn't say I was like flattered, only because, it wasn't because of me that they were, doing it. But in the sense that they thought that the work was worthy enough of being collected in a trade paperback. And this was I believe, the first time that any of my work had been reprinted. So I was very excited about that, but also with the knowledge that it's not because they think that Glenn Greenberg's name is going to be on this is going to sell. But just at the fact that it was deemed worthy enough, that the quality was worthy enough that it's worth putting out there again.
For sure. Now, this obviously had not been the first time that Hobgoblin Lives had been reprinted. This had happened, I think, not long after the original miniseries.
Yeah.
Do you remember? Was there discussion about when the first one was going to be recollected? Because this was still in '97, so right around the time when it would have come out. Do you remember any conversations about putting it into trade paperback? Because again, that's a relatively new format for current stuff at that point in time.
No, I mean, I think we heard that they were going to be collected in trade paperback, like, almost immediately after we put out the third issue. I mean, I mean, as I recall, there was not a lot of time between us finishing the original series and then being told that it's going to be collected in trade paperback. I still remember calling Ron Friends and asking him for a new cover, and writing I remember writing the back cover copy and all that. And it was all still fresh in my mind because we had only just recently wrapped up the series. So it was pretty a quick turnaround.
Now, a question I feel like I must have asked you this before. So if I did, please, I
won't answer.
You won't answer. So again, this is kind of gets into my own personal history with Hobgoblin Lives. So when it comes out, I would have been about 13. I've just started buying Spider-Man regularly, and I see that this miniseries is coming out. I'm like, oh, I should give that a shot. So I'm reading it. I'm really enjoying it. And a big thing that meant a lot to me as a young reader and really making me a student of the Hobgoblin, making me really get invested, was the decision to have the source page at the back, where it breaks down per page what the reference point is and where these issues came out, or where these stories first took place. And so as a new reader, I don't have these issues, but I'm learning about the context, learning the numbers of issues, and kind of putting it into a frame of reference in my head. Do you recall where in the development of the project this decision was made? Because it's kind of an interesting one. They didn't have to put this source material in there. It adds a lot of context. I'm curious whose idea was it and what kind of discussions there were about it.
No discussions. It was Roger. And I agreed with him. Because a lot of this stuff was continuity and information that was almost a decade or maybe more than a decade old at that point. So we wanted to give fans a source so that if they want to go back and look at the original stories, they could easily do that. It was really the same thing as just the way Stan initiated the whole footnotes thing. But instead of running footnotes throughout the issue, which would have bogged down the story, we put them all in the back. It's the kind of thing that, I remember there was a mini series that DC put out in the mid '80s called America versus the Justice Society that Roy Thomas wrote. And at the end of each issue, he had a source page that showed you he wasn't just pulling the stuff, out of thin air. That all of this historical references and all of the mentions and all, the continuity that he was picking up on, he showed you exactly where that stuff came from, which to me gave it, a lot more weight. And I loved it. And DC in its infinite wisdom, when they put the book out as a trade paperback a few years ago, they dropped all of the text pages that Roy Thomas wrote, giving you all of those reference points, which made no sense to me whatsoever. It's like that was what was so, one of the things that was so cool about that series was being able to know where to go to find those incidents, those events that he was referring to. But anyway, so this was in the mid '80s that Roy did that. So when Roger wanted to do it for Hobgoblin Lives, it had already been done. And I liked it. I didn't have any problems with it. And certainly Brevoort, who was my boss, he didn't express any concerns either. It was going to be helpful because one of the criticisms that we had with Hobgoblin Lives was you're tying up a storyline that's almost 2 decades old at this point. Nobody cares. Nobody remembers any of this stuff. So it's like, well, we're going to write this story so that you don't really need to have read the original stuff. We're going to really write it that way so that we're not so dependent on footnotes and stuff like that. It reads like a new story, but if you want to go back and read those original stories for yourself, here's where you go. And I think, Roger did a masterful job of it. I'll tell you, as much of a Star Trek fan as I was, I wasn't as big a Star Trek fan when I went in to see Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, okay? And Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan is a sequel to one of the original TV episodes called Space Seed, which had been made 15 years before Wrath of Khan, okay? I went to see Wrath of Khan without having ever watched Space Seed. It's just an episode that I hadn't caught. Well, I'm watching Wrath of Khan. I didn't feel lost. With all the references to 15 years earlier, to the episode where Khan was introduced. And that's, I feel, how we did Hobgoblin Lives, where, you don't need to have read the original stories. We'll catch you up. We'll fill you in on all the information you need to know and not get bogged down in extrapolation and boring details. We're going to, take you on this journey. That's based on old stories, but you're not going to feel lost. And I think we accomplished that.
I mean, I think so. I guess I'm proof of that because again, I was a kid. I, just reading some Spider-Man comics and loving the story, loving the art. And, I found it very easy to follow along with. And again, I loved all the context stuff at the back so that I understood a little bit more what was going on and what was being referenced. So I would say that that is a measure of that being successful.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that, of course.
One thing I hadn't seen until this particular repackaging of those two storylines was the Spider-Man Hobgoblin timeline that Roger Stern had compiled, which I guess was in the original trade, which I guess had never had, or if I had it, I don't think I read it closely enough to realize there was back matter. And that is an extremely dense timeline, but is fantastic.
Now, refresh my memory. Does the timeline in the new trade paperback, the one with Goblins at the Gate?
Yes, because that's the one I have, and I do see that it is there.
Okay, because I've got both editions, of course. I've got the original trade paperback of Hobgoblin Lives, and I've got the second trade paperback with Goblins at the Gate. So I don't remember. But yeah, Roger worked all that stuff out. Now, I was completely on board, and I was sort of like on the, I was on the train, in the engineers, the locomotive. I was in there with him because in preparation for that story, I sat down and reread every single Hobgoblin appearance since he first appeared. So I was completely in sync with Roger. And so, if he had made any sort of like errors in the timeline, that way I would have, been able to catch it. And, that didn't happen. He didn't need me for that. But that was all Roger. Roger put all that stuff together, and he loved doing it.
Well, I mean, it definitely comes out. Now, a question, you mentioned in your blog post that, Hobgoblin's really what brought you into Spider-Man.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, so you're age 13, you get entranced by this character, which is an interesting parallel to me, also falling in love with Hobgoblin at age 13.
I know, right? Yeah.
Which is kind of funny. Well, what was it for you that really captivated you about the Hobgoblin at that time? You mentioned in the blog post that you were already a fan of the Green Goblin, so
Right.
there's obviously a Goblin connection. But what was it that really made him sing to you?
Well, that was it. It was a new Green Goblin. It wasn't going to be yet another Harry Osborn puts on the old suit or Bart Hamilton puts on the old suit. This was a new spin on it. And here I was getting in on the ground floor of this new character that is sort of like an offspring to a certain extent of the Green Goblin, but he's his own thing. And it's this mystery. Who is he? It certainly didn't hurt that his first appearance was penciled by John Romita Jr. and inked by John Romita Sr. It was a gorgeous looking issue, and Roger did a great job with the writing. So when you've got that quality, because new characters were getting introduced left and right, and that wouldn't have been enough to hook me on Spider-Man as a regular reader again. But the fact that it was just done so well. But like I said in the blog post, it really the Goblin connection was what really pulled me in.
Now, when you were doing the research with Roger and you're reading all the Hobgoblin stories to print at that point in time, I'm asking you to remember what you thought 25 years ago, so I understand that's a giant ask, but do you remember what was kind of the favorite that kind of bubbled to the top in terms of the Goblin stories at that point in time?
I love the origin, his debut. I loved Roger's last storyline that kind of carried from 240. I can't remember the issue numbers anymore, but it was the one where the Hobgoblin appears at the
Century Club.
The Century Club. And it turns out I think it was a robot. It was, and Roger planted the first clue that it was that Daniel Kingsley was posing as Roderick. That I think that was in that issue. The big showdown, which ended with Spider-Man and Hobgoblin in the water, and Spider-Man comes out of the water, clutching Hobgoblin's mask. All that stuff was great. I thought that Tom DeFalco and Ron Frenz did some great Goblin stuff, and that it was really starting to go somewhere when their run was prematurely ended. But I remember, I think it was like 275 was like a double-sized issue, and you had this beautiful artwork by Frenz and Brett Breeding and I think is that the one where the Hobgoblin snatches Shashan and Flash Thompson?
I believe so.
Yeah. And Hobgoblin was such a dick to her. I mean, he literally like insulted her appearance, and he was like such an ass. I mean, so mean. And it was like, oh wow, they're really doing some interesting stuff with him, showing a different side to him. And yeah, of course, him secretly being Roderick Kingsley, although Tom never wrote him as Roderick Kingsley, but he would be bitchy, being this fashion magnate, like, cosmetics and all this kind of stuff. He was like in the fashion industry, Roderick Kingsley. So he would look down at a woman who didn't, meet his ideal for beauty. So, he would be very kind of bitchy to her. He, if I remember correctly, he insulted her appearance. He says, "You're too plain for anybody to care what happens to you." It's something like that, something along those lines. And even though Tom never wrote the Hobgoblin as Roderick Kingsley, in retrospect, it worked really well. This is all my memory. I could be completely talking out of my rear end, but I do remember him insulting Shashan as he's flying her over the city, having snatched her off the street to hold as a hostage. So, am I right about all this? Is my memory?
I'm pretty sure you are.
Okay.
Now my memory's a little hazy as well on that particular one, but I think you are correct.
Okay. So yeah. So those are the stories that I remember the most. So basically, it's all the Roger and DeFalco stuff. Because after that, the whole thing just kind of went down the tubes. And with each post DeFalco Hobgoblin appearance, it just got worse and worse and worse. I felt like, my interest had dwindled with this character until the moment where I got the green light to do Hobgoblin Lives.
So I have a question there, though, because I wondered, you mentioned briefly in the blog post about kind of, cutting Peter David slack for, 289 because he was put in an impossible situation and trying to figure something out. So I'm curious, like, how do you reconcile in your head what it was like as a fan to read Amazing Spider-Man 289, and then as someone who's worked in editorial and has worked as a creator to look back on those decisions? Like, is it easy for you to reconcile what happened with kind of knowing and understanding how the sausage is made and how that particular sausage got made?
I really didn't take that into consideration. I mean, when I read 289 when it came out, I bought that the day it came out, and was taking the subway home, and I was like, immediately sat on the subway and started reading it on the way home, and I was like, huh, what? What? This is it? And I felt it was a complete disappointment. But I didn't know, like you said, I didn't know how the sausage was made back then. So I was like, wow, this is kind of not really that good. And so it was a colossal disappointment. And it felt like over the next few months, all they were trying to do was like put Band-Aids on it. Oh, well, now we're going to tell the story about, how Ned Leeds became the Goblin and the Hobgoblin in the first place, and his relationship with the the Rose, and we're going to fill in all this backstory after the fact. And I was like, you're trying way too hard to make this work, and it's just what a mess. And that's pretty much how I left it, and it always left a bad taste in my mouth. When I found out the truth about what had been going on behind the scenes, and just how political it all was, and the whole disaster of firing DeFalco and friends off of Amazing Spider-Man, what a mess that was, and what the original what the plans were, what Peter David was being told to do and refused, in terms of wrapping up the Hobgoblin story. Excuse me. It was like, and then years later, when I'm at Marvel and I read this interview with Roger Stern where he says, "Oh, I could easily step in and go back to my original resolution, and it wouldn't be affected at all by any of the stuff that's happened since. I could go back in and do my reveal as originally as I planned it, and it wouldn't be affected by any of this. In fact, all the stuff that's out there, I can use it and tell a new story with it." And that intrigued me. I had no idea that, not only did Roger, not only was what Peter David came up with, not what Roger had in mind, but even the whole Ned Leeds thing was not what Roger had in mind. It also turns out it wasn't what DeFalco had in mind either. but knowing that, the story still could be done, that intrigued me. I didn't really think about all the other stuff. I mean, Peter David has always stuck to his guns about why his story works. And Roger has very politely reiterated why it doesn't work. And I side with Roger.
I mean, I do too. And I think Hobgoblin Lives #1 pretty effectively said why.
Yeah, I mean, I don't blame or mind Peter defending his work. I mean, of course, you're going to want to do that. I mean, I could see how much work Peter put into that issue, but when you take a step back and you look at it in the context of the entire Hobgoblin storyline and expectations and where it was all leading under Roger, under Tom DeFalco. It really doesn't work. It defies the intent of everything that came before. So I completely understand Peter defending his work, but I just it's just a fundamental disagreement in that there's no way that the Hobgoblin, given the strength that he had, that was demonstrated to have, that he would have been taken out the way Ned Leeds was.
I want to jump back for a second to say that you were right. Your memory is correct. Amazing Spider-Man 275 does have that sequence with the Hobgoblin and Shashan.
Yeah.
He says, because you are rather plain, my dear, unattractive, and obviously not too intelligent, I figured very few people would care if it became necessary to dispose of you. Besides, I have this thing for beautiful women, and I've learned from past experience that it isn't easy to menace someone I find appealing.
Okay, so bitchy, and who's bitchier than somebody in the fashion industry? So
Right.
There you go. Oh, good, good. I'm glad. I'm glad my memory is still. There's still shreds of it left.
So I'm curious about. I'm going to come back to the Hobgoblin Lives of It All. You mentioned in your blog post that there was that kind of this flurry to create new content, and I was thinking like, well, it was kind of near the end of the 90s where you started having things come apart and we started having less books and because sales were down. But I guess you've kind of answered this question already, because I guess because of Liefeld and crew taking the main books away, there was just more content in general that needed to be published to kind of make up for you guys not having those books anymore. Is that what was happening?
Well, also, the industry was in free fall, and we had to double down on the stuff that was actually selling. And at that time, the surefire bets were X-Men and Spider-Man. And so, we were just pumping out Spider-Man, and X-Men, and just looking for ancillary projects to beef up the line and make budget. And doing a Silver Sable, an extra Silver Sable book wasn't going to do it, or an extra Fantastic Four book, to be perfectly honest, just wasn't going to do it. Whereas Spider-Man and X-Men were sure bets.
When you start working on Hobgoblin Lives, actually, I guess before technically, when you talk to Roger and Roger tells you the Hobgoblin's identity, was that kind of a surreal moment to be like, I'm talking with Roger Stern and he's telling me the truth about this character that I loved when I was 13?
I don't think at that point I really looked at it that way. Because I'd been there for a few years at that point, and a lot of like the fanboy stuff. I never lost my enthusiasm for comics or what I was working on, and I always tried to find something, even if I didn't like the project, I tried to find something I could be enthusiastic about with it. But that kind of stuff, that not to disparage like fanboys, but that kind of thing is a little too fanboyish for where I was at that point in my life. I was a professional. I had been a professional for several years at that point, and it was like, Roger, you're going to have to tell me who the Hobgoblin is. And he said, okay, it's Roderick Kingsley. This is how it works. I was like, okay. And my first and only thought was, hopefully that this will be enough for the people above me to be satisfied and approve this project. That's what all I really cared about, was getting the project approved. That Roderick Kingsley was going to be a satisfying enough answer that it was like, all right, let's do this. That was it. I really wasn't thinking in terms of I'm one of the few people in the world that know. That's a little too fan kind of mentality.
Mm-hmm.
For where I was at that point.
Okay, perfectly fair. You detail in your blog post, again, I'm really shilling.
I mean, look,
13-year-old blog post.
Just to tell you, Adam. I mean, I knew about JLA Avengers before like almost anybody, because one of the key people working on it kind of confided to me that it was happening and swore me to secrecy, and I was like, okay, yeah, sure. All right, sounds good. And it's going to be Kurt and it's going to be George. I was like, okay, cool. And I was enthusiastic about it, but it's not like, oh my God, they're going to do JLA Avengers. It's just like, I was past that point. So just to give you another example of that kind of like thing, So it's a combination of just being in the business and seeing a different, experiencing a different side of it, and also just being jaded as hell. Anyway, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
That's okay. So when you do move on and you're associate editor and you talk about this in the blog post as well, and then you get the call from Ralph Macchio about pitching in on Spectacular Spider-Man, and then he's like, okay, I need like an arc. You have an idea. And you mentioned how you quickly knew exactly what you wanted to do. Obviously, you had to call Roger first. Why was that the first thing that sprung to mind? Was that just like your favorite idea, or like it's interesting because that's such a specific? You had talked with Roger. Roger had mentioned, what if it was like if the Hobgoblin and the Green Goblin actually got to, see each other, because now they're both active at the same time, which had never happened
with the original
Spider-Man before.
The original guys. Yeah.
I should say, yeah, because you're right. We'd seen Macendale versus Osborn, Harry Osborn, but that's not what anyone wanted. They wanted, the OGs of both. Right. So what was it about that you're immediately like, this is the story I need to tell, and I need to get Roger on board?
The fact that he needed a 3-part storyline. He needed something big, an event to promote. Ralph Macchio, I'm talking about, the editor.
Yeah.
He asked me specifically through a 3-part storyline, something that could be promoted as an event. And, it was still fresh in my mind because it wasn't, all that long before that Roger and I had done Hobgoblin Lives, and Roger had expressed to me interest in doing. Now that we had reestablished the original Hobgoblin, he said, the next thing I'd love to do is original Hobgoblin versus original Green Goblin. And there were no takers. I mean, maybe that's not the right way to say it. Not that they weren't the right takers, but I don't know if Roger pitched it to Ralph Macchio, who was the Spider-Man editor at that time. I don't think he formalized the pitch to me and Brevoort. It was just a notion that he had talked about. And by that point, I was no longer working for Brevoort. So, and Brevoort wasn't really doing any Spider-Man ancillary stuff anymore by this point, when I was working on Spectacular Spider-Man. So it became a point where it was for me the most obvious story to do. It was just the most obvious thing to do, and we could totally get 3 issues out of this.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's like what that would have been like about 66 pages of stuff. I go, okay, well that's a big storyline. We could do. I mean, it would have been great to have the extra pages the way we did for Hobgoblin Lives. That's a book of that length. But I mean. We also this was right before decompressed storytelling really became the thing, and so it's like, what, if we're professionals, we could tell a big story in just 3 issues. We don't need a 12-issue saga to do this. So yeah, that was all of that was going through my mind. Really, it was like, okay, 3 issues, something big. Yeah, let's get those 2 guys together. But it was a story specifically that Roger had pitched to me. And now I was in a position where certainly I could do it, but I wasn't going to do that to Roger. I had to give Roger the option. If Roger objected to it, I wouldn't have done it. But it's like, well, don't object. Join me. You know what I mean? So yeah, so that was all going through my mind at the time.
Now, in terms of like division of labor, obviously, like the way it's credited is that you guys plot together and then you're doing the script. But obviously, Stern's name is the bigger name at this point, so his is the name that's advertised more prominently. And you kind of mentioned in the blog post that you don't really care about that because you got to work with Roger. And this was an important story to do. Do you still feel that way?
Oh yeah. I don't regret putting Roger's name first. Roger has always been very forthcoming about, he's always said, well, Glenn did all the heavy lifting and he really shouldn't have given me top billing, but but I also know that the editor-in-chief at the time told Ralph, because obviously everything had to be cleared with the editor-in-chief and blah blah blah, and and Ralph told the editor that, the editor in chief, that I was going to be bringing in Roger Stern, and he's like, "Oh, that's a great idea." He goes, "Oh, that's great. That's great." So I knew the value in having Roger associated with this, and look, I mean, he, in terms of the creative end, I mean, I did the typing. More, and I kind of like was almost like the secretary, pulling stuff together and all that. But I didn't make a move without consulting with him, and he gave input and where he felt it was needed and all that. And I felt like he was my partner on it, but also I felt like his name had marquee value, much more than mine. And ironically, when at least one of the issues came out, by that point, Marvel was putting the names of the creative teams on the covers, the writer and the artist. And I think by the last issue, they accidentally left Roger's name off the cover, so it was only my name. And it was like, well, okay, this is here's the nod to me, is my name's on the cover. Rogers isn't. I can't remember if it was the entire run or just the last issue. But I'm pretty sure it was the last issue. But it was like,
you're correct. It is just the last issue. I'm just looking at it now.
Okay.
It's funny because I don't think I'd ever realized it, but I think it's also because the red that they used on that last issue really melds into the kind of city on flames in the background, so it's not as noticeable. But I had never picked that up before.
Yeah, well, that was the fate, sort of like shifting back into my favor and saying, this is your reward, Glenn, for giving Roger top billing. But no, I don't regret it at all.
What I love about the story, which is really a lost art because it just doesn't happen as much anymore, is that you have this fun story, but you're still pushing subplots. There's still subplots. There's still other things going on that aren't directly related to the main brunt of the plot. And that is just something we don't see in general in books anymore because they're some more insular, or people write for trades or whatever the case might be. And you just see a little bit less of that. So when I go back and read it, it does feel like a breath of fresh air because you're telling this good story, but you're also furthering what the characters had already been doing in the book, which is a lost art.
It is. It is. The craftsmanship of writing comics has really fallen by the wayside, and subplots help bring readers back issue after issue after issue. And there's a way to do it, even if you're writing for the trade. There's a way to do it so that you can keep ongoing subplots going ad infinitum. And still collect, whatever it is, a 5-issue or 6-issue run into a trade paperback. But then, you can have subplots carry over into the next trade paperback kind of thing. Mm-hmm. If that's the way people are reading them. Jerry Conway was really good when he was, especially when he was writing Batman. He was really good at the soap opera elements that continue from issue to issue, while also telling one-issue stories. And it was the soap opera stuff that kept you coming back for more. And he always timed it so that it was a 6-month block. And so, a storyline that began in one particular issue would ultimately wrap up 6 months later. But in that last issue, he'd be setting up the next round of subplots. He did a great job of that on Batman in the early 80s. I mean, it was tantalizing for me. There was a Poison Ivy storyline that ran 6 months, and alongside that there was an election where one for mayor. There was an election for mayor where one candidate wanted to outlaw Batman, and the other candidate wanted to fire Commissioner Gordon. So it's like either way, someone we love is going to get hurt by this. So it's like, my God, what's the solution going to be? And then it wraps up 6 months later, and in that last issue, he starts setting up the next set of ongoing storylines. It was brilliant. It was like a masterclass in serial writing, you know. And that's completely lost today, you know. And it really is a shame. And I think to a certain extent, I don't know so much about Roger, but that was certainly something that I was conscious of, because I was there, you know. I was in the trenches, and you know, still working to a certain extent with the Spider-Man office, and that was something that I always loved. So, you know, as much as I could with, you know, in the power that I had at the time as the writer, I really wanted to stick to that kind of thing.
For sure. Well, and I think you and I have talked about this before as well, but the idea that, you know, at times modern comics can feel like an issue is just a chapter as opposed to having its own beginning, middle, and end. And so that's one thing that's, again, very clear when I flip through these issues and read them again, is that, you know, you're telling full stories. It's part of this arc, but you're still getting a full adventure in each issue. And then you have a cliffhanger and you come back for more. And again, I feel like when I go back and read these comics from, you know, 80s and 90s, I get more of that than I do from modern ones. And I still like modern comics, but they're just a different beast. And you're not getting that full unit of entertainment in the same way, because you might only get a small sliver of the story, and it doesn't feel like it stands on its own as well.
Right. No, I agree with you 100%. I think that the readers are getting the short end of the stick, because they are getting less for their money. And I think that you know, it's going to sound very old school, but you know, we just gave more content for, you know, for the readers' hard-earned cash. You were just getting more content per issue, and I'm you know, when I see, you know, 18 parts storylines that, you know, I mean, I could have written this stuff in, like, you know, 6 issues, or, you know, 9 tops, you know. As I recall, I mean, I don't think I've ever worked on more than as a writer, I don't think I ever worked on more than a 3-issue storyline. My Dracula miniseries was only 3 issues. Goblins at the Gate was 3 issues. Hobgoblin, well, I didn't write Hobgoblin Lives, but even my Star Trek miniseries, which was 5 issues, but each issue was its own story. But in terms of like a multi-part story, I don't think I ever did more than 3 parts. And I feel like I packed a lot of story into those 3 parts.
100%. So a question that's always been on my mind, and maybe I've asked you in the past, but I'm going to ask again. When you have the showdown between Norman Osborn and Hobgoblin in this storyline, spoilers, I mean, of course they're going to meet. Was there back and forth about the fact that Norman wasn't going to be in the costume?
Well, originally he was going to be. Okay. Well, actually, you know what? Let me hold back a second. Okay, we were specifically asked after the storyline got rolling. We were specifically asked not to put Norman in the Goblin suit, and we said, "Well, can we do it just for this one occasion?" At the time, the regular Amazing Spider-Man team specifically said, we have plans for Norman, and we don't really want him to have any reason to put the suit on, because when, you know, if and when he does, you know, we want it to be a big event, or Norman at this point in his life, Norman is beyond the Green Goblin. He's got bigger fish to fry. He doesn't, you know, he wouldn't be putting the suit back on, at least of all to fight the Hobgoblin. That's just not where he is as a character at this point. And that kind of stymied us. And I think I came up with the idea of, well, at the end of the story, how about he just puts on the mask, but he's still wearing his business suit, and he flies off on the, you know, can we do that? And I don't know if Ralph checked with the Amazing Spider-Man team, but he gave us the okay. So maybe he checked with the Amazing Spider-Man guys, and they're like, yeah, okay, fine, that's all right. And we made a joke of it at the end. You know, we said, is that the Green Goblin? And it's like, well, if it is, he's certainly dressing a lot better these days because he's wearing an expensive business suit, but he's wearing the Goblin mask as he's flying off on the bat flyer. So that was foisted upon us fairly. I would say when we were working on part 2 and getting ready to write part 3 is, I think, when that came up. We were just about to start working on part 3, which obviously was the conclusion.
Interesting. Now, I will say one thing I really like about that final issue, and there's a few moments where you do it, but and actually I have a question about this. So
yeah,
you have some really interesting moments where, like, obviously Kingsley's really interested in the idea of, trying to unmask Spider-Man. And he has this moment where he looks at Norman and realizes the reason why Norman doesn't seem to care and the Goblin doesn't care is that he already knows.
Yeah.
And then and Osborn just gives him this awesome smile. Like, Luke Ross really does a great job with the art there.
Yeah.
Because, he realizes how outclassed he is. And then when we go back, then we go to another subplot, we come back, and then we have Osborn just asking about this, this journal. And then he's revealing that he knows that all of this is fake, and that Kingsley's big leverage was fake all along, and that he knew it all along. And so I love these moments where you have Osborn just clearly outclassing Kingsley, which then culminates in one of my favorite moments, where Kingsley realizes that all of his companies have basically been bought out and taken over by Osborn, and he just looks at him and he's like, well, how could you have accomplished this so quickly? And again, Luke Ross doing a great job on the artwork. He just had this great sinister look from Norman, just says, I'm Norman Osborn. And so I love those 3 moments, always have, but I'm curious about it because in some ways you and Roger are almost, I guess you're elevating the Green Goblin, but also kind of tearing down the Hobgoblin a little bit because he's so outclassed. Was there thought about, should we do this to the Hobgoblin? Like, kind of make him kind of get punked by Norman? Or was it just fun to kind of show how much superior Norman was? Like, I'm just curious from a writer's perspective what your thoughts were when you do these moments, which I do love.
Okay. I can't speak for Roger. And we're going back, almost 30 years. But what I can tell you is the general consensus, and I've heard this from Ron Friends when I've talked to Ron Friends about it. I think that I feel this way. I think a bunch of people feel this way. Once Norman came back, the Hobgoblin became redundant. It's really tough for the Hobgoblin to justify his existence when you've got the original Green Goblin back. As long as Norman was dead, there was a position that the Hobgoblin could hold in Spider-Man's universe. So once Norman came back, I think even Roger, to a certain extent, was like, well, listen, Norman's the original. I mean, he's the guy. And so, if Roger objected to us, sort of diminishing, and I don't agree that we diminished the Hobgoblin at all. I think we just showed what sets the Green Goblin apart. And really, what sets the Green Goblin apart from the Hobgoblin? They're both, wealthy businessmen. They both have that formula running through their system. They both dress up in Halloween costumes and fly around the city throwing pumpkin bombs, right? What sets them apart? And, me sitting at the feet of the master, Roger, the thing that set the Green Goblin apart from the Hobgoblin is Norman Osborn is insane, whereas Roderick Kingsley is not. And that insanity gives the Green Goblin a certain edge. It's undeniable. It doesn't diminish the Hobgoblin. It just gives Norman a greater edge because he's unpredictable. He's crazy. He can do, you don't know what he's capable of, whereas Roderick is kind of like bound by his sanity. It's like, I wouldn't do that kind of thing. And so Norman can really think outside the box. It's not so much that one is better than the other or one is greater than the other. It's like these are 2 different characters. Now, at some point, could Roderick outperform Norman? Possibly, sure. But for that story, it was like, listen, Norman's back. and we're going to make the most of it. And Roger was completely on board. I mean, I think Roger might have come up with when Roger and I was like trying to wrap up the story, and we came up with the idea of Norman buys all of Kingsley's properties behind his back. I remember Roger saying, and Roderick could be like, how could you do all this? And Norman just smiles and goes, I'm Norman Osborn. And both of us were like giggling like little school boys, when we were coming up with that scene. It was really both of us. I mean, it was both of us feeding each other. The whole concept, when Roger said yes, he'd be interested in doing the story with me, the first thing that popped into my head for the story, and this was in that conversation with Roger, that initial conversation. As we're talking, I said, Roger, I have like the beginning of the story right in my head. And I said, remember how Kingsley became the Hobgoblin because he got his hands on all of Osborn's old journals about the Green Goblin, and that's how he created the whole Hobgoblin identity. But all the journals supposedly burned up, and Roger was like, yeah, and you could hear in his voice he's on the same wavelength, and he knows exactly where I'm going. I said, what if one of the journals survived? And I was like, yeah. And then the whole thing started to like go from there, like the conversation. And then ultimately we realized, well, he's going to claim that one of the journals survived, Kingsley, and he's going to try to use it as leverage to get out of prison, right? But it's going to turn out it's all BS. It's a trick, because he's such a weaselly guy. So that was like, him and I were just like bouncing ideas off each other. We were on the same wavelength. I'd be going somewhere and he'd be like, yes, exactly. He'd be going somewhere and I'd be like, yes, exactly. So that's how it all kind of worked. So no, there was no concern that we were diminishing the Hobgoblin. This is believe it or not, this is the first time anybody has ever said that to me, that there was any inkling that we had diminished the Hobgoblin in that story to sort of prop up Norman. I don't think we did. It's been a while since I've read the story. I'll take another look at it. But I think we just stressed. That was the one thing that Roger kept saying to me is, the thing that sets them apart is Norman's crazy and Roderick isn't.
I do have to apologize. I didn't mean to say that you were necessarily diminishing the Hobgoblin. Obviously we're elevating one against the other, which I think makes sense because, as you say, he is the original, and I guess that is the intent to show, Norman Osborn has no limits. Like nothing will stop him because he's crazy.
Right. But also we wanted to, the thing is Roderick gets to a point where it's sort of like, who needs this crap? It's like, he goes, why am I still doing this at this point? Who needs it? I mean, it's like, I don't need this anymore. I don't have any sort of like long-term commitment to being the Hobgoblin at this point. I just want to get out of here. I want to retire. I want to like go off to some island and be drinking, martinis, on the beach. I don't need this. So for him, it was like, it's not a big deal for him to cut and run at that point. That ultimately became his goal, whereas Norman was committed to staying where he was, which was, as a major business force in New York City. That Roderick had moved on from that point already in that story. So it was like, we knew where Roderick wanted to go. And so we ensured that happened. Whereas Norman wanted to stay. I mean, for Roderick, it was like, why am I still doing this? Who needs this anymore? Who needs the aggravation?
I always appreciated, first of all, I love the ending because I did love Kingsley just, hanging out on a beach somewhere. Because it was an interesting ending because he didn't really he lost his company, but he still had enough that he could just hang out and do his own thing. So I always felt like that he lost, but he didn't completely lose, and he wasn't in prison anymore. So really, he did kind of win. Right. And, and Osborn won because he ended up with all of Kingsley's stuff under his control. So really the only person who lost was Spider-Man, which is, kind of a classic Spider-Man tale too.
Well, that's funny you mentioned that because at one point, I think when we were writing the last issue, I think either I went to Roger or Roger came to me, and I said, I think it was I went to Roger and I said, this has been great. We've got this really great dynamic going on. There's a lot of stuff happening in this story, and it really feels good, except Spider-Man doesn't do much. I said we really have to sort of realize that and rectify it. And so that's why we made sure that there was a scene where Spider-Man is like I think evacuating people from a fire and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I think I said and Roger and I both agree, like, let's make a story point out of it, that this was really Norman versus Roderick. I'm stuck in the middle. I really didn't accomplish much out of this because Roderick got away and Norman is even more financially powerful than he was before. And it's Mary Jane who basically says, how many lives did you save today?
Mm-hmm.
You did win, and Roger, I think Roger suggested that. And I was like, oh, that's great. That's great. Okay, let me write that down. And of course I worked that into the plot. And so, yeah. It's not that Spider-Man lost. It's just, he was caught between two titans, and he just did the best he could to muddle through.
Now, something you mentioned in your blog post as well that you kind of got stymied on as well is that you do have the reveal of who the other Green Goblin was at this point, although not one that the reader gets to see. But technically it does occur, and originally it would have been more on panel. So was that also kind of a right at the end kind of limitation, kind of like not being able to have Norman in the costume? Like, was it around the same time as you guys were prepping that third issue that we realized that we couldn't actually use this stuff? Well,
Norman not being in the costume came first. Okay. And then I think we were working on the third issue when Ralph came to me and said, the Amazing Spider-Man team has plans for the guy who's in the Goblin suit. They have plans to reveal who that is. So you can't reveal who it is. So it's like, that was like strike two for me. It was like, oh man, we can't have Norman in the suit, and we can't. And for me, it's like, I was excited because even though they took away the whole Norman in the Goblin suit thing, it was like, okay, as sort of like a consolation prize, we'll at least get to reveal who this mysterious new Green Goblin is. And then that got taken away from us too. But whatever. We were too far into the story at that point for me to like say, well, then I quit. It's like I wasn't going to do that. It was like, all right, we'll just muddle through. And I don't think it hurt the story all that much. The big thing, the big thing that Spider-Man was going to accomplish was going to be unmasking the new Green Goblin. That was supposed to be Spider-Man's big accomplishment, is ripping the mask off. When that got taken away, I even made the argument. I said, Ralph, that was Spider-Man's big contribution to this story, is he was kind of, I know, Glenn, but can you just work around it because they really have a story in mind for this mysterious new Goblin. It's like, Ralph, you're the editor. If you can't convince the Amazing Spider-Man team to let us do this, of course we'll abide by your wishes. And so, it was a disappointment, but we dealt with it. It was going to turn out to be Phil Urich, and we were going to reveal that. And I actually planted the seeds for this in the Osborn Journal, that Norman knew who the new Green Goblin was at the time when it was when Phil Urich was operating as the heroic Green Goblin, and at some point off screen, and we would have revealed this in retrospect. At some point, Norman captured Phil Urich and brainwashed using that brainwash machine, Dr. Winkler's brainwash machine that was established as part of the continuity. He would have used it to brainwash Phil Urich to operate as the new Green Goblin under Norman's control.
I like that.
And that was the original ending. Now, I understand that years later, not that I understand, I actually read the stories. I think it was Dan Slott who established that Phil Urich was the new Hobgoblin.
Yeah.
And he killed Daniel Kingsley.
Yes.
Not Roderick. He thought he killed Roderick, but it turned out it was Daniel. So yeah, I mean, the idea eventually got picked up. I have no thought that Dan Slott stole my idea. I never discussed it with Dan. Dan had no idea. This was a pure coincidence that Dan picked Phil Urich to be the Hobgoblin. But the idea originally was that it was going to be Phil as the duplicate, not duplicate, but the fill-in Green Goblin that was working for Norman. But yeah, it was just a pure coincidence. It's just that I might have gotten there first, but I didn't get it across the finish line. And Dan, I'm sure came up with it separately, and he got it across the finish line.
I will say that one thing I think I prefer about yours is that it involves mind control, because I always liked Phil as a character, and I liked him as the heroic Green Goblin at the time. So I was a little sad when he kind of broke bad. So I would have in some ways appreciated your version more. It's interesting.
Me too.
that Phil killed Daniel, because I remember at the time when it looked like he killed Roderick.
Yeah.
I think I was suckered for a minute. Like and I was like, wow, I don't know how you can get out of that. And I'm like, of course it was going to be Daniel. Like, why not use the twin and get rid of the twin in some way? But yeah, I remember reading that and being like, oh yeah, okay.
I'm not a big fan of killing off characters. I think there was probably more use to be had from Daniel Kingsley. Not that he had been around for very long, but it's I might not have killed him off, but it was a clever twist. It was a clever twist. I'm glad they didn't kill off Roderick. I would have been much more annoyed about that, even though it's not my character. But I feel a certain paternalistic affection for Roderick Kingsley, even though he's not my character. He's Roger's character. But I feel like I invested so much time and effort into him that if I'm not paternalistic, I'm more like sort of like an uncle, a very loving uncle.
One thing, as when I was rereading Goblins at the Gate, one thing that stuck out, which is a small thing, but it's interesting based on timing. Obviously, these days you typically don't see smoking in comics, like with most things. But it's interesting because it's very prominent that Norman Osborn is smoking throughout this 3-issue story, with very specific plot moments where he's like blowing smoke in Kingsley's face, or he needs to smoke a light, so Kingsley's kind of supplicating to him and he's giving him a light. So it's interesting making use of this artifice and not just using it for aesthetics, but actually almost building it into the character of Norman is interesting, because I guess this was around the time, I believe, when that kind of stuff started getting phased out. Yeah, I know it happened more aggressively under Quesada. But it's just interesting that we, this is one of those kind of last bastions. Reading it's almost like watching Mad Men. You're like, oh man, there's smoke everywhere.
Yeah. No, this was one of those last gasps when I think it was around this time or right after that Ben Grimm stopped smoking cigars, Nick Fury stopped smoking cigars. It was in the mix. It was not long after. But I don't think Roger and I really gave it a second thought at the time. It was still a very prominent thing.
Mm-hmm. Anything I haven't asked about Goblins at the Gate that I should have?
Well, I do. I mean, you mentioned it briefly before, but I do want to mention the really significant contributions that Luke Ross made. Luke was a really good artist back then, and he only got better. I mean his stuff just, it was sort of like a quantum leap forward, watching him grow over the years. And he was really good back then. I mean, around the same time, I was working with Joe Bennett on a Spider-Man project that I was writing and he was drawing, and he and I, he didn't quite capture what I had in my head, whereas Luke was much closer in terms of when I'm writing this plot and then the artwork comes in, I'm like, oh this is really, this completely works with how I visualized it. I mean, in a perfect world, since this was a sequel to Hobgoblin Lives, Ron Frenz would have drawn this storyline, but I don't think it ever came up. I don't think it was ever considered for us to ask Ron. I think number one, he might have been knee deep in stuff at DC at that point, but also it wouldn't have been fair to Luke unless we found another project to take the place of this. It would have been fair to deprive Luke of 3 months worth of work, So it just worked out that he was really, really good. And I'll never forget because I think he doesn't live in America, and he was at a New York City Comic-Con a bunch of years ago, and I walked up to him and introduced myself. It was the first time we met in person, and he gave me the biggest hug. And it seemed like he was as enamored of my work as I was of his. And I mean, again, two people who have never met each other before, and we were hugging like we were brothers. He was great. He just did a terrific job, and he was a real pleasure. It was a real pleasure to have those pages come in. He really captured it all really, really well. And I believe Al Milgram was inking him.
Yeah, that's right.
And Al, was, working on a book that wasn't behind schedule, so he was able to do the great jobs that he was capable of doing. Al became, the go-to guy when you needed literally something done overnight, and he would do it for you. And it would be competent, but it wouldn't be a book that looked like he had a month to ink it. And so that hurt his reputation, unfortunately. But when he had the time and he was on, he was getting the stuff on schedule, he was getting, the work was coming to him on schedule to ink. He was up there with the best of them as an inker. He's a terrific inker. And so, I mean, him working with Luke, it was a great combination. And I know Roger, who is very concerned about, how his work is translated onto the page. And when an artist is more focused on drawing a page that he knows he can sell in the future rather than actually sticking to the storytelling, Roger gets very, up in arms about that kind of thing. And he didn't register any issues with the stuff that Luke was doing. And you're right about the little moments, Norman, that smile when Norman says, "I'm Norman Osborn," and all the body language of the characters. I mean, Luke was really the right guy to draw this story. If we couldn't have Ron Frenz or John Romita Jr., Luke Ross was a really great option.
Mm-hmm. One other thing I'll mention, that there's a moment when Hobgoblin and Norman are fighting, and I think Hobgoblin's like choking out Norman, and just the look on Norman's face is like so menacing and terrifying. Like he's being choked out, but he's just like, nope, like I'm not gonna let this happen. And like he's just so crazed.
Because he's crazy. He's so crazy. That's something that Roger just, I mean, working with Roger on Hobgoblin Lives, and then, working with him on Goblins at the Gate. I mean, and just talking to Roger, interviewing him from Marvel's in-house fan magazine, Marvel Vision. And, I interviewed him for it when we were doing Hobgoblin Lives. And just, that's the thing he kept stressing. Is Norman is crazy, Hobgoblin isn't, and that he actually told me, I'm sure you remember that Bill Mantlo issue of Spectacular Spider-Man, the issue where Roderick recreates the Goblin formula and immerses himself in it and gets the super strength for the first time. Remember that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Roger said to me that he stressed to Bill Mantlo, make sure you establish clearly that Roderick is not driven insane by the formula. Norman was. And Mantlo's script kind of like sort of fudged it a little bit. So if you read it, if you read the actual comic, it's written in a way that you could come away thinking that, Roderick is now just as crazy as Norman was, now that he's got the formula. And that irked Roger. Roger was like, oh, if only I could have gotten a crack at that script and just tweaked it just a little bit. But that was something that he really, really stressed. So the scene that you're talking about, Norman is insane. He doesn't know, to when to back off or to like be worried, Roderick is sane, and his first thought is, do I really need this crap?
Mm-hmm.
I could be on a beach somewhere. Norman doesn't want to be on a beach.
I do like, again, the idea that as much as Kingsley may not be crazy, he's still very calculating. That there's the moment when he's first being broken out of prison by Green Goblin, and Spider-Man's like, I'm trying to save you, and he's like, your concern is touching but quite unnecessary, because he's already thought it through. He already has his own plan. He doesn't care that the Goblin has something against him. He thinks that he's got something over the Goblin, and I like how calculating he is in that moment. And Peter just can't understand it. Peter's just like, I'm trying to save you. Obviously, the Green Goblin's going to hate you. I'm just trying to save you from dying. So it's just an interesting juxtaposition of the two characters. And I thought you guys did a really good job selling that moment. And Luke does a great job showing the physicality of that moment, where then Kingsley just kicks Spider-Man off the Goblin glider, and it's a great moment. Yeah, I mean that was the thing. We wanted to really stress the fact, Peter's in over his head here. It's the two OGs. Are it's like almost like the adults are having a conversation, little boy. You shut up and stay in the corner. That's kind of like the feel that we ultimately ended up with. So yeah, I mean, Peter, I wouldn't say he's necessarily outclassed, but he's a little bit outclassed. You know what I mean? It's like you've got these two schemers, and the only real difference is, one is completely out of his mind. But still very crafty, That's the thing, is Norman is crazy but competent, and yeah, that gives even someone like Roderick Kingsley some cause for concern. I'm thinking about all this. It's like I'm falling in love with that story all over again. I'd love to do a sequel. But I had so much fun with the scripting. I mean, there was one line where Spider-Man mentions new Coke. The old ways are sometimes the old ways are still best. Remember New Coke. So I just remember stuff like that. I loved writing Spider-Man's wisecracks. I always felt like that kind of stuff came easy to me for some reason. And I'm not like the biggest wisecracker on earth, but writing it, I'm able to write wisecracks when I have time to think about it. On my feet, I'm not as wisecracky as Spider-Man. I try to be, but I don't always succeed. I remember saying once to Tom DeFalco, I said, I find Spider-Man, his dialogue really easy to write. And he looked at me like, yeah, right. What are you, crazy? Tom, who's one of the best Spider-Man writers, I guess it doesn't come as naturally to him. You wouldn't know it from the actual work. But for me, it was like, I was like, one draft Greenberg. I was like, it just flowed out of me for some reason. And I loved writing. I tried to fit in as many wisecracks and as much, topical humor and that kind of stuff as possible. And when it really landed, I felt a lot of satisfaction. It's funny, that moment you mentioned, that crack, is actually really well written because of one of the word choices you use. Because what Spider-Man says is, hey, you don't mess with the successful formula, Kingsley. Remember New Coke? And the use of the word formula when you talk with the Goblins is obviously intentional and a really nice touch. Yeah. Boy, I was good, huh? One last thing I'll ask you about before I let you go for the evening. One thing I really liked is how you guys paced out your cliffhangers in each issue. Like the first installment ends with Kingsley and Norman are finally face to face, so that's obviously a big moment, and you don't bury it. You just let them, have it at the end of that first issue. Plus, there's another Goblin in the room, which is obviously a bit of intrigue. Yeah, and that was Roger. Roger worked that out. Yes, yeah, that was.
that first ending was I think pretty much all Roger. He came up with that ending.
And the second one is a great one, which then you diffuse nicely in the next issue, where it ends with the Hobgoblin about to unmask Spider-Man, which is, a trope, but a fun and enjoyable one. And again, it works extra well because of that moment later on in the third issue where he realizes that he's the only one who cares. That Green Goblin and Norman don't care about this information because they already have it.
Right. Yeah. The second cliffhanger was me. Because at that point in his career, Hobgoblin, what's the one thing he hasn't accomplished? He never found out who Spider-Man was, and how Spider-Man is there at his mercy. Of course, he's going to take off the damn mask. Why wouldn't he take off the damn mask? Knowledge is power, and this was his long-running enemy. And yes, it is a tired superhero trope, and I knew it at the time, but I was like, but it suits the character. The character would want to do this, And when Roger and I talked about the next issue, again, I don't remember whose idea it was, but it was like, but we were. I remember we were both like, again, giddy when we were like, when Hobgoblin realizes that Norman Osborn doesn't care because he already knows, I just remember Roger and I just like really being like excited about that. These little moments that we came up with, it's great. Yeah.
It's interesting because that actually, I feel like it works on multiple levels, because part of the reason, at least in the wording of it, why, Hobgoblin goes to unmask Spider-Man or even cares about it is because he's irritated at the Green Goblin for robbing him of his victory over Spider-Man. So he's like, I'm going to take out Spider-Man. I'm going to beat him. Yeah. And then the Green Goblin, interferes, and he feels like he didn't get that moment. So now he wants the identity. And then, so already the Green Goblin has robbed him of something. And now later on, he gets robbed of finding out his identity as well. And then it's at insult to injury. It's because someone else already knows and already beat him to the punch. So it kind of works on an extra level there, because he already got denied a victory, and now he's getting denied finding out this piece of information because the Green Goblin already knows, and therefore it's less valuable because, it's not as privileged information.
Yeah, well, also, I mean, Spider-Man unmasked the Hobgoblin at the end of Hobgoblin Lives. So one turn deserves another kind of thing, it would have balanced the scales, So yeah. Yep.
Well, again, Glenn, thank you so much for taking the time. I think I said it was going to be 45 to an hour, and I should have known we're going to go an hour and a half. But,
well, you want to talk so much about Hobgoblin Lives.
That's true. I couldn't help myself. I love these books so much, and being able to talk to someone who was intimately involved with it, I can't not ask the questions.
Yeah. Listen, I appreciate the questions too. And I'm glad I ate dinner before we started recording, because
me too.
Because I'd be kind of loopy right now. I'd be giving you like the most ridiculous answers if I hadn't eaten before. But no, it's an honor to be so remembered, and I really do appreciate you enjoying the work so much, and that your interest survives. I feel that way about a lot of things too, and it's nice to be on the receiving end of that.
Well, again, thank you so much for your work, and thank you for taking the time to chat about it, because it was a real thrill. And, that 13-year-old who fell in love with the Hobgoblin because of these stories really appreciates it.
Okay. My pleasure. I'll talk to you next time.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Okay.